Hey folks, welcome back for the last talk of the day of the Angular Day Verona 2020 Virtual Edition, where we are going to hear about deploying apps to the cloud at scale by one and only John Papa. John Papa is a dedicated father and husband, a professional web developer, and avid open source and community advocate. He currently is a cloud advocate for Microsoft and has formerly worked for Disney on several web and mobile applications that you may have used. His passions are coding and teaching modern web technologies and enjoying everything Disney with his family. John is also a co-host of Real Talk JavaScript podcast, author of the Angular Style Guide and many popular Pluralsight courses. So please everyone, welcome John. Hey John, how is it going?
How's it going, everybody? Has it been a
Welcome.
great day out there? Have we had a lot of great talks already?
Quite some. So what's the current time in your time zone, John? Is it early morning or?
Oh, I don't really keep track of time anymore, so I've got to watch for that. It's almost noon for me. It's almost lunchtime.
Oh, okay. So not that early. Yeah, it could be pretty hard to keep track like now with these special times where you're kind of stuck at home. So okay, I'm really interested. What have you been like working on like last couple of days or months? Like what was like the most interesting thing you've been like spending your time on?
Well, the most fun is that now to do conferences, I can just log in like this, and I don't have to worry about making plane reservations and traveling and going through security. And so a single conference doesn't take 4 or 5 days of travel to get there. Although I do miss the travel and meeting people in person and talking to people after and before the talk. So that's the downside of it. But that's been my year, and I can't complain. It's been pretty good though.
Sounds pretty great. So anyway, without further ado, let's just jump straight into the topic, please.
Sounds good. And I want to welcome you all for coming here today online at Angular Day. And I appreciate that you're all sticking around for the last talk. And I've seen some great ones so far as I've been tuning in. And I want to thank the organizers for having me here as well. So one of the things that I want to talk about with you all is when we're deploying these Angular applications, one of the things that gets really difficult is to figure out, excuse me, here we go, the slides are working. One thing that's good to figure out is that when you have an application and you develop it, the web is a key part of this whole application. It's really only the first step, getting it up to the web. There's so much more you have to do. In my past life, I've deployed a lot of these web apps up that have tens of millions of users. And when you just deploy an app up to the web, lots of things can go wrong, as you all know. But the fun part is that we get to develop the applications, and Angular makes this fun. Now, our businesses that pay us money to do this kind of work, they need your app to be fast. It's got to be secure. It's got to scale, and it's got to just always deploy, because when you roll out changes, it can't take months to do something. It has to get there quickly. Well, my name's John Papa, and I'm a principal developer advocate with Microsoft. And today I'm going to show you how you can do this with Angular apps very easily to make them get all of those things out of the box. So where do we begin? Let's start with an application. Now, today, everybody's trying to buy food and groceries and everything, but also stay safe, possibly at home. So how do we do this? Let's say we develop an application that lets us shop online, and then these groceries get delivered to us. So we built this app, and it's awesome. It connects people all over the world. But now we have to deploy it to the web and get it to our users. How's everybody going to use this, especially if they could be anywhere in the world? So first, we start with our code. That's the place as developers we love to start, because we enjoy writing code. This is easy. This is great. We write the apps in Angular. We push it up to GitHub. And then we get to GitHub, and then we're like, okay, now we want to get this to the cloud. But what else do we need? Remember, our business requires that we're not just getting the app up there, but it has scale, speed, and security. So now we need something like CI/CD. We want some process to make sure that every time we push changes to our live branch, that it goes off to production. We also want to make sure that we've got our APIs and that they're running fast and securely for our application. And then once we've got APIs to get our data, we need to be able to route those requests between our app and the API. And if you remember dealing with cores and things like that, you might need a reverse proxy to work with that, set up security settings. How do you set those kind of things up to route between two different hosted apps, an app and an API? Don't forget about custom domains. You want your own domain up there, and you want SSL out of the box with HTTPS. So we got a secure connection. And security doesn't stop there. We also want to make sure that the people who log in are who they say they are. I am John Papa indeed, so therefore we want my application to authenticate me. Well, what about roles? Just because I'm who I am, that's great. But what if you have roles in your application where certain users can do certain things? For example, in our application, we want everybody to be able to create shopping lists. But maybe we only want a certain type of user, like a preferred user, to be able to edit the lists and look at discounts at grocery stores. Well, we also need global scale. You might be in Italy, or you might be in the United States, or you could be in Australia. You could be anywhere around the world. So we want our site to be located around the world at different CDNs. And of course, we built an app. We started with, wow, I really love writing code and I love developing apps. Oh boy, there's a lot of things to think about. But wait, there's more. You can also be writing in things like Angular, or you might choose to use things like React, or maybe Svelte, the new hotness, or Vue applications, or one of 30 other web frameworks that are out there and popular today. No matter what you do, should it really matter what type of web framework you're using to be able to deploy the apps to the cloud? It probably shouldn't. But the interesting thing is, years ago, we didn't have a lot of these problems because we were just deploying scripts to a CDN and that was it. But today, web development has changed. Let's take a look at why. With an Angular application, we're going to run npm run build, some kind of npm script. And then that script is going to go and churn behind the scenes and build with the Angular compiler. And out is going to come effectively our three main types of assets: HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Now we could have fonts and images, of course, too. But these are the core pieces of every web framework. And really, that's all the browser cares about. So we don't really need much of a web server to be able to handle these files. The browser just takes these files and hosts them. But we need something to build it. So what's going to build this for us? In the end, we just want our Angular app to push those, to build that, a server to build it, push it up with CI/CD, and then have those files hosted on the web. So let's take a look at what we really want. We want to be able to build and host web apps. And we call these static web apps because the files really don't change once they're built: HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So you got to build it, and we have to host it. We also want some kind of authentication and authorization. Authentication is I am who I say I am, and authorization is here's what I can do. We also want some kind of APIs, maybe with Node Express or something like Fastify or serverless technology like Azure Functions. And then we definitely want some kind of CI/CD. And in this case, I'm going to show you how to do it with GitHub Actions, because you can use different kind of CI/CD systems with whatever application you have. So with all of that, what we're really going to do is look at a repository that has, in this case, an application and our API. So imagine we've got an application and we make these changes to it. We push up those changes, make a pull request up to GitHub. So it gets to GitHub, and GitHub's going to fire off what's called an action. The action is effectively our CI/CD process. The action is then going to say, all right, here's my code. I'm going to build it with whatever steps you tell me to build it with, probably npm run build, in our case, ng build -- prod. And then I'm going to send those files up to a web server in the cloud. That's going to be our static content, the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. We also wanted to deploy our API, because the API could be written separately in serverless tech like Azure Functions. Now, collectively, when both these are pushed up to the cloud, they become our static web app. And that's what Azure Static Web Apps does. It puts all this in the cloud for you by running through this process so you can reach all of your users. All right, so we talked a lot about kind of what we want to do. We want to build an app. Where we want to get to. We want to get to security and speed and scale. Let's actually show you how you can do this with a demo. We'll start off by taking a look at an Angular application and how it works. Is that shopping list. And then we're going to add an API to it so we can get our data. And then we'll add authentication, all with a live demo here, in just under 20 minutes. So we'll start where everybody else starts, which is with our code on GitHub. All right. So what I've got here is a Visual Studio Code application, which has a folder in it called Angular app. Now, I want to show you where this comes from. So first, and I'll show you all these links later as well, everything that you're going to see today, you can get from this repository up on GitHub, and it's under the github.com/johnpapa/shop@home application. And you can get the same repository by clicking this big green button over here. Use this template. It'll copy all the source code over for you. So I've already done this. And when I go over to this repo, I created a repository called Hello Angular Day. And in it, you're going to see an Angular app folder. There's also React, Svelte, and Vue. Why? Well, because we can. So I've actually written the same app in all 4 technologies just so we can try it out and see how it works. Today, we're going to look at the Angular app. And all the Angular app is inside of this folder. And the API for the functions is on the API folder. Now, why might this relate really well to have an app that's got multiple folders? This is called a mono repository or a monorepo. Now, you might have a monorepo of your own that's got several Angular apps in it. The cool thing about this is we're going to see how we can have a monorepo with Angular and an API and still deploy up to the cloud using Azure Static Web Apps. So looking back now, I've cloned the repo locally here. So here's my Angular application. Here's some of my components that are up in the application. And I've got some services and some other fun stuff. I'm also using NGRX in here, a bunch of things that you're probably very, very familiar with. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to get this up to the cloud. Like our application works here. Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go look at an extension that we have called Azure Static Web Apps. Now I can scroll down and look for it. I've already installed mine. If it isn't installed for you, you can type in Static Web App and just find it and install it right here. So what does this do? It allows us to be able to basically click a button and then deploy the app locally up into Azure. So let's try this out. So the first thing we're supposed to do is you'll see over here on the left, we've got this Azure icon. Now I can click on that. I'll close the right-hand side. And when I click on that, you're going to see this Azure Static Web Apps pane over here on the left. I'm making it super big so we can see it. Now I'm going to hit the plus button and that will let me create a new Azure Static Web App. Now I'm doing that in the demo, but just to show you, I can hit F1 and open up what's called the command palette. And then I can choose create a static web app with the keyboard and I can do the same thing. So everything can be very keyboard driven here. All right, so let's hit plus here. And when I hit the plus sign, it's going to prompt me and say 3 steps. We're going to create a static web app. First, you got to enter a name for the app. Let's call this John Papa Hello Angular Day. It defaults to the repo. You can change it to whatever you want. And then you can choose here from one of the preset built options. We already know about Angular, React, Svelte, and other kinds of apps. What this will do, though, is pre-fill in where is the application located, and then where does it build the code, and what's the build command or the build script. But just to show us how this works, let's choose custom. So when I choose custom, now it's going to ask me for where is the application. Now, by default, it's saying, is it in the root or do I want to enter the app? I want to manually enter the location. So I'm going to type in here, my app is actually in a subfolder called Angular app, because remember, I'm using a monorepo. And then it's asking, where is your Azure Functions code? Now, if you don't have Azure Functions code, you can skip. I happen to have some, so I'm going to put it in the API folder by default here. Then the next step, now this is really important, and it's different for probably every web framework out there, pretty much. What is your build path? Now with Angular, we all know that by default, Angular builds our application in a folder called dist, D-I-S-T, and then sometimes slash the name of the project. So here's where you type in dist, name of my project is Angular app. That is my build output folder, also known as an artifact location. So I enter that into here. And then finally, I choose the closest location to where most of my users will be. In my case, I can choose US 2. We could also put in here Western Europe if we want to be closer to where the hosts are. So once I choose that, I'll zoom out a little bit, you'll see a dialog in the bottom right that is working. And it says it successfully created this new static web app. And it says a GitHub action is building and deploying the app right now. And it's going to be available once that this completes. So I can go look at that action right here. But before I do, over on the left, you can now see there's an Angular day right here, and there is a production node. It's waiting for deployment. We can see that we've got an action right here. It's actually currently building our action right there. So that's not completed yet. But if I come back down to the notifications, I can click on the bell, open that up. I can now say, go open actions in GitHub tab. Let's bring this browser over to the right window. Now we can see in that same repository, we've got this action that's being built. It's yellow because it's in process. And you can also see it's been in process for about 38 seconds right now. Now, how long is this going to take? It's going to take about as long as it takes to build your Angular app. This Angular app takes about 3 minutes to build. So it's going to take a little bit here. So let's take a look at what's going on while it builds. I can click on this workflow. And now when we make it full screen, I can click on the workflow file. And here is a file that got created for me automatically. Now, if we scroll down to line 30 right there through 32, and I'll highlight those. What it's showing us is the 3 fields that we filled in through the wizard in Visual Studio Code. It has to know where is your app in this repo, because it could be anywhere. Where's your functions? It could be anywhere. Mine's an API. And also, where is the built app going to be? That's in dist/Angular app. So it needs those 3 fields so it knows how to build and deploy everything. Everything else is pretty much out of the box for us. Now, this also shows you that if you mistype something in the wizard, you don't have to delete and start over. You can just edit this file. This is a GitHub workflow file, and it's just in your repo. So you can edit this at any time. If I go back up to the root of the repository, I can show you where it puts it. It puts it in a .github/workflows folder. And there's the file right here. And what's interesting is you might notice it gives it a name like com.rock and then some ID at the end of it. So here's our com.rock, and we can scroll back down and we see lines 30 through 32 are the locations. Now, if we go back to the actions, let's take a look at what's happening. We'll click back on the action. If we click on the left where it says build and deploy job, we can see the process. Now, first it does some setup. That setup takes just under a minute to get everything ready to build. And then it's doing this build and deploy, which is now working on right now. And it's been working on for about 1 minute and 48 seconds, according to the clock over here on the right-hand side. So while that's building, let's go back to VS Code. And let's go back down here. Notice in the bottom left, you'll see I've got a GitHub marker saying I've got I'm 1 behind from my origin up in GitHub. That means that I need to pull. Now think about what might need to be pulled, because I just pushed everything up there. What needs to be pulled is that new workflow file. Notice there is no workflow file in my workflow folder here locally. That's because I didn't create it. The Visual Studio Code extension did it for me. So now if I pull, which I can click that button down there to do, or I can come up and type Git Pull in my command palette. Now if I click on the workflows, you can see that same file right here locally in your code. And this is where I would edit it. I wouldn't edit it up in GitHub. I might come down here and maybe it wasn't called Angular app, it was called Shop at Home, and I can edit it there and make my changes if I need to. So that's why there was a change down here. Now, if we go back up online, we can see the process of the build and deploy. A couple things to scroll through. You can see here it built the Angular application. That's all my Angular output. And then when it was done, it's detecting where the API is. It just finished up, so we'll open it up again. Let's go look at that. And the output just disappeared. Let's just refresh it. We'll go back to the action. Now it's green because it's done. So it's a little excited that it finished on me. There we go. Build and deploy. We're going to scroll to the bottom of this. At the very bottom of build deploy, it's going to tell you that it's using npm. It did npm install. And then you'll see some color coding down here for deployment complete on line 228. We can visit our site at this URL right here. Now I can click on that and it'll open up a browser. And there's the application that just loaded up on Azure. That is our application. And if I click on list, we can see the shopping list that we have and discounts that we have right now. Now, we haven't done anything with authentication or authorization yet, but you can see that we've got an API And we've got our source code up and running right on Azure right now with global scale. Right out of the box, we can tell we have HTTPS, we've got SSL, but we don't have a custom domain. So remember I said it's easy to set up a custom domain. Here is one called shopathome.dev. If you go to that URL, you'll see another version of this app running, and I own the domain shopathome.dev. So you can see it running here, and it automatically sets up SSL for any domain I own that I associate with this account. Now, why didn't I do that for this one? Because I don't have a domain for every time I run these demos to reassociate, and domain setting up sometimes can take anywhere from 15 minutes to 24 hours for it to propagate around the world, as we know with DNS. But let's say I wanted to associate a domain with this. Could I? Absolutely. Let me show you how to do that real quick. So let's bring over another tab, and up on the Azure portal, you'll see I've got this John Papa Hello Angular Day. This is where I can set up all of my configuration. It's a little busier than doing it in VS Code, but it's more powerful because now I can go to the Custom Domains tab. I can hit Add. And let's say I own a domain called Angular Day, which I don't. But let's say that was my domain. I could type in angularday.com. It would validate that I own it, which I don't. But if I did, I would validate this. And then it says up top, just copy this DNS record, this CNAME, and go put it on my DNS provider. If I do those two things, generally within a day, 24 hours, your domain will now be associated with your website. Now, if I go back here, and I showed you the shop at home works, if I look at the shop at home one, I go to custom domains, you'll see I already have one called shopathome.dev already associated. So that's why the shop at home works out of the box. So that's what's giving us this app here, but ours does not quite yet have it. Now, there's one problem with our application, besides we haven't done authentication and authorization. Everybody who's built Angular apps knows that when you build an Angular app with custom routing, notice I've got /products. What's going to happen if I refresh this page and it's hosted on a CDN? It's going to go look for, on this server, a file called products.html. There is no products.html because I'm not using server-side rendering here. I didn't set it up. I could have, but I didn't. So when I press refresh, watch what happens. I have a 404. That's no good. Now, why is that happening? Because there is no products.html on the page, but we don't want to have to worry about this. So there's a way to set this up and configure it with Azure Static Web Apps so it doesn't create that 404. So let's go back to, and we can get back by getting rid of the products, by the way. So let's go back and host it. There we are. Let's go back to VS Code. And over here, remember, we've pulled our code down. Let's just commit these changes real quick. Those are the ones I forgot about earlier. And here's our application. And our application, again, has this router that's got these routes in it. And I can take a look at these routes. It's going to go to home. It's going to go to products and discounts, but there's nothing to handle this products HTML. So let's flip back over to our presentation. Now, once we take care of the application, we also handled right out of the box global scale, because now we have our application deployed at least 5 points of presence around the world. So it's in Asia, it's in Europe, it's all over the place. So it means our users can get to it quickly. So over there, if you're in Europe and I'm here in the US, even though I deployed it, my initial one to the East US, you can also hit it quickly from Western Europe. Now, we also have www for custom domains that we can set up. We've got our SSL we can set up automatically that gets handled for us. We've got our Azure Functions automatically connected. And notice, even though the Azure Functions run on a different port than our static site, which is effectively in storage in the cloud, we don't have to worry about setting up cores or reverse proxies. It handles this for us. And then finally, we got our CI/CD. So we got all these icons on the bottom right out of the box. Next up, we're going to set up our routing for our authentication and authorization and handle that, what we call fallback route for the products HTML. So let's go back to our application. Now, there's a special file that we can add to our app that will automatically set up route configuration. We want to basically say, if somebody goes to a route that is unknown on the server, automatically load index.html. So to do that, we need to tell the server where to put this file. Now, here's a quick quiz for you. where does Angular by default have a folder that will automatically deploy its assets to the cloud? Well, here's our Angular app. And you're right, there's an assets folder. I gave you the answer right in the question. So I'm going to create a new file in the assets folder called routes.json. And effectively now this routes.json file is going to get deployed with the Angular build process by default. And Azure Static Web Apps looks for this file called routes.json when it does its loading. So what do we need to put in here? Luckily, I've got a nice little snippet, which you can get from my Angular snippets extension in VS Code Marketplace. And this is going to add a default route, which says effectively, hey, if you find any file that is not found, go ahead and load index.html. So that's what we need to set up the fallback. But let's go a little further. So if I committed this and pushed it, we'd no longer have that problem with the 404. But I also want authentication. So let's go back and look at our app. I want to set up this application so that everybody who comes to it can get to this homepage. But only if you authenticate and I know who you are with, let's say, Twitter, GitHub, or Azure Active Directory, one of those three, that I know who you are, you can then go and have your shopping list. You can look at that link. Right now, anybody can look at the shopping list. And I'll set up a second level of authorization where only people who are preferred users can get to discounts, whereas right now everybody can get there. So let's go set up this authentication and authorization. Inside of our routes, what I want to do is first say, look, we can authenticate with Twitter, GitHub, Google, Azure Active Directory, and Facebook. 5 different ways. 5's a lot of options. I want to limit that to Twitter and Google and Azure Active Directory, just to pick 3. So I have another snippet in here just to show you how this works called auth providers. Now, out of the box, all 5 of those auth providers work, but I want to restrict and basically take away the ability for Facebook and Google, in this case, for authentication. So those are the ones I'm going to take away. So we will be able to use GitHub, Twitter, and Azure Active Directory. So effectively, in the application, Twitter, GitHub, and Azure Active Directory will still work to authenticate, but Google and Facebook won't. Now, what are these links actually doing? The links are actually running against .auth/login/Facebook, or for the GitHub one, it's going to run against /GitHub. When we run those, it's running with EasyAuth to go authenticate with that provider to find out, hey, if you have an account with these, let's let you log in with those. But I'm going to restrict it so Facebook and Google don't work. Okay, so that's going to let me authenticate. But what's going to let me not just authenticate, but also restrict routes? So let's go ahead and add another snippet here. I can restrict my API. So imagine that I wanted to create a role called preferred users. Once you authenticate, only people who have a user account of type preferred can get to the discounts, because I don't want to give them discounts unless they are that level. Maybe I charge for that or something. And anybody who goes to my routes that begin with this pattern, API/X, because maybe X means edit, so they only get read-only otherwise, effectively, can get to these if they are preferred. Meaning, I don't want you to be able to edit or create or delete a shopping list unless you're also preferred. So effectively, only if you're authenticated, the only thing you can do if you're not preferred is look. But if you are preferred, you can also look and create. Now, I'm going to go ahead and commit these changes locally here. We're going to add routes. And then I'm going to push it up to GitHub. Now, that's going to take about 3.5 minutes to build again. But so we don't have to wait for it, let's go look at the final solution so we can see what this does. So over here on the Svelte app, this is our shop at home that's live. Notice that when I go to my list, I can't see it. It says unauthorized. When I go to discounts, it's unauthorized. I go to home, it's there. Why is that the case? Because I set up the routing in this application, it's only letting me look at the homepage because I haven't authenticated. And also, I'm on home up here. If I hit refresh, notice the fallback route now works. So it reloads index.html. No more 404. So how do I do more than just look? I want to go look at the list. I need to authenticate. Now remember, I made it so that you couldn't log in with Google. So if I clicked on Google, it's now going to do 404. That's because I restricted that. If I do Facebook, same thing. But let's try Twitter here. When I click on Twitter, it's going to go over to Twitter quick. That'll authenticate me. ask for my consent. I've already given it mine. And then it'll redirect you back to the app. How do you know it worked? Well, once it's in, I display in the app my Twitter ID, because now I can look at my info and tell it that it's Twitter. That's the provider. So now if I go to list, you're going to see it's showing my list right here. If I go to discounts, now it's showing me I'm unauthorized. Why? Because I'm only authenticated with Twitter. I haven't been authorized for that preferred user. So let's log out, which is again using .auth/logout as a URL. And now let's go back to the home, and then we'll go to list. Notice I can't get in again. If I use GitHub, I've already set up this custom provider to allow me to authenticate and be authorized as preferred. Before I go click on this, let's see how it works. Back in the portal, I can click on role management. And under role management, you'll see there's a user identity of my GitHub user ID, John Papa. It's a GitHub user ID. And not only do I have anonymous and authenticated, but I have preferred role. Let's say I wanted to add my daughter. I come up here, I click on the provider, I say GitHub. My daughter is Madeline Papa. And then I tell it's for this domain. You can have more than one domain on here. And then I can type in the role I want. I only have to add preferred because everybody gets anonymous and authenticated. And I can say this will expire in 1 hour. And once I generate this, I get this thing I can copy. It's an invitation that I can copy to the clipboard. I can then come up here, and then I give it to my daughter, and she would then basically click on this link, and effectively, I'm not my daughter, it would automatically ask her to log in and accept this authorization. Now, I've done that for me, which is why you see my name right here. So because I've authenticated, and now I set up authorization for a preferred role for John Papa with GitHub, when I come back here and I log in with GitHub, it'll take me to GitHub. It'll redirect me back. Notice on the left, I'm authenticated with as John Papa on GitHub. I can get to my list. And when I go to discounts, I can get to my discounts. And as a reminder, why does that work? Because on line 12 here, I said that you have to be in the preferred role, line 13, to get to the route API discounts. Also, same thing for editing anything in the API. You can see how easy it is to set up authentication, restrict it, set up your own authorization rules, set up fallback routes, and publish your app over and over again. Now, if we click on the Azure icon here, we come back to this production Angular day, and we can click the button to refresh, or we can come up here and just refresh by right-clicking. It should show us what the current action's done. It says here is that it's built and deployed, and it did it, let's see, what's that time say? 14 minutes ago. That seems like it's the old one. Oh, there's one, add routes. So that's the one it's building now. This one says succeeded a few seconds ago. So what if I want to go look at that site? Maybe I close my browser. I can actually right click and choose browse site right here. Tell VS Code it's okay to open it. There's our site. Now, if I go to my list, notice it's not showing me the list. It's giving me a different error message. It says, okay. And won't let me get to the discounts. I'd have to go to list, authenticate with Twitter. It'll redirect me, ask me my consent. I'll grant it. And now notice on our ComRock, the one we just deployed here for Angular Day, we can now get into the list, but I probably can't get into discounts because I didn't set up that custom authorization. Cool. So let's go back to our slides here. What did we do? We set up all this stuff with Scale, and we got our authorization, authentication, and our SSL with our application, all of our security. So we got security, speed, and scale for Angular apps. All of these things are probably not the first thing you think about when developing an Angular app. If you're like me, you really get excited about writing the code and putting the app together. But then all this stuff is really important when you deploy to the web. The cool thing is when you use Azure Static Web Apps, you can deploy all this stuff and it handles all those things in the background for you. And right now it's called Azure Static Web Apps Preview because it hasn't hit general availability, which is effectively the full release that you get. And for right now, it's all completely free. We're looking for feedback on the team up on the GitHub repo for this, which I'll share links for at the end. So if you have feedback on what you'd want to see or any of the questions you have, you can reach out to me or check out the GitHub repo. Now, I happen to show you that there are 4 different versions of this app running. We can use it with Angular, React, Vue, Svelte, pretty much any web framework that you want to use. And if you want to try this yourself, and I highly encourage you to, you can do everything I showed you today by going up to any of these links. The first one is a full hands-on tutorial called our learning platform. It's Microsoft Learn, where you can build an app, choose if it's Angular, React, Vue, or Svelte, then deploy it to Azure. You can add an API with Azure Functions, and then you can also try it with Blazor or Gatsby. We have those options too. If you want to check out our documentation, you can go to this link here. We've got about 20 pages of docs that you can check out for more details. And let's say you don't use Angular, or you are using Angular, but using some other framework too. Maybe you're using AngularJS version 1. Maybe you're using Hugo. Maybe you're using Flutter. I have a repo here called johnpapa/hello worlds. And from that repository, I've got over 30 web frameworks in there that you can use to try to deploy to a static web app. So I want to thank you all for coming today, and thank you for a wonderful day at Angular Day and for joining us here, for everybody for putting on this great event. And I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thomas, you are muted.
I'm sorry.
It has to happen.
last one is the charm, right? So happened finally, I got muted. Anyway, John, thank you very much for a very insightful talk. I really have to say that, like, to remind us, like, it's very easy to forget, like, about all these things you should be taking care of after you pushed your code. So I think it's, like, very useful to remind ourselves about these kind of things. And all these things which you demonstrated looks like extremely smooth, like from the developer experience perspective, like all these integrations, like straight from the editor to see it all updating. I have to say that experience looks very, very smooth, very, very nice, and must be very, like, really like a pleasure to work with. Which brings me to the question which you partially already answered, as you said, like it's in a developer preview, so we're like looking for the feedback. But what is the idea, like, once it's really out, in terms of, like, if people want to use it, like maybe to start like with some like smaller hobby projects, or like just like some demos to get like used to working with this kind of approach or like process, like will this be accessible, or if there will be like some barrier to entry, like maybe you need to provide a credit card or something? What's the idea?
Yeah, those are great questions. Right now, there's no credit card or anything. If you go to this Learn link, the first link that's up on the slide that I shared, if they go to learn-swa-path, when you set up the applications and try it out there, it's all completely in a sandbox on Azure, so you don't have to worry about logging in and signing up for credit cards or anything, which is great. If you have an Azure account, you can use it on your own Azure account today. And if you, let's say you don't want to use Learn, but you don't want to sign up for Azure, there's also a free Azure account that you can sign up for. I don't have a link on the board, but it's basically just Google free Azure. And there's a link you can go and get a couple $100 worth of Azure credits for free. But let's say you want to use this later. Like, what's preview versus release? The preview is we're showing all these great features, we're gathering feedback and taking public feedback so we can build this up to be more useful for other scenarios. For example, one of the early feedbacks was people wanted to use Blazor, which is WebAssembly for .NET, basically. So we added that to it. Another thing that we're working on and heard very loudly is not everybody wants to use GitHub Actions. Some people want to use, for example, Azure DevOps as their CI platform. So we're looking at how we can integrate with other CI platforms. This is the kind of feedback we're looking for to see what does it take before we can actually get to the full release.
Makes perfect sense. Another thing which got like thrown around in the presentation a couple of times was like this global scale. And you said, like, if you have a customers like in Australia, America, wherever. So then I would be also interested, like maybe like about the defaults, or like what is kind of like a configuration, like what we can expect like from that point of view.
Yeah, it's a good question. That's also something we're gathering feedback on, is what places in the world should we have these points of presence for effectively the CDNs to host these. What's really happening is these assets, the HTML, it's being hosted on a web server in storage. Amazon calls theirs S3, Azure, we call it Azure Storage. They're being stored, and then we've got these CDNs that host those files. Now, we've got these around the world. So they're in Asia, they're in Europe, they're in the United States, etc. And all these locations, what happens is the files get distributed to all of them, and based upon where your users are located, they'll hit the closest server. So that's why they're getting that. That's how CDNs work, right? You get the closest presence on the edge. So that's why you're getting this global scale. The only reason you have to choose a location up front is because when you first deploy, you've got to start somewhere. The first thing you deploy has to start at a certain location. And that's the easiest thing to do at your location.
Makes sense. Now, maybe a bit more technical, like basically when you've shown us like those like route configurations, like from the Azure perspective, which you can deploy as an asset, there you show how you could like block like some API endpoints so that they don't deliver the data. So then when you go like to the shopping list and you don't have the role, you don't see the data. Would this be also realistic to use it like to, for example, block some of the Angular lazy loaded bundles so that you don't even like not even show that route at all because it gets blocked like on that level? Would this be like feasible?
I haven't thought about that. I'd have to look a little deeper into it. Obviously, you could use routing guards to do something like that with Angular out of the box. But let's say you didn't want to do that, but you wanted to do it through the routes configuration. I'd have to get back to you on that, honestly. I haven't tried that.
Because sometimes there is like this requirement where you really like you have some like I don't know banking software, so you like really want to be secure, like really secure, so not even deliver this kind of stuff. So this would be for sure like a very interesting use case for some folks, I can imagine.
Yeah, and just thinking about it for a moment, the one way I have done this is I've written a routing guard that looks at the authentication provider information. So, and you can do that now. Like you notice when I log into the app, I could tell you that I was logged in as John Papa on GitHub. So I could use that information in a routing guard to say, oh, you're not in this role, therefore let's block this particular lazy loaded route. But that would require code. I'm not sure out of the box if we could do that.
Thank you. Still staying like with this kind of like authentication authorization topic. So basically what you demonstrated is there are like these special URLs.auth, right? Like / whatever the providers.
Yes.
So if I understood correctly, this is something which you really get out of the box. So you don't need to really implement any kind of integration. You just maybe like need to enable it and that's it, right?
Exactly. And it's using an implementation called EasyAuth, which if you Google that, you can find more details about it. But it allows you to log in, log out, and also to get user information. So you can get information from that provider about when they logged in.
Nice, thanks. Do we have something? Okay, looks like also in the chat we got a question from the Richard, who is asking about like this Azure Storage, which is then used like to make these static files available for the CDNs on the edge, if it's like eventually consistent, because he just saw that S3 is now instant.
I'd have to get back on how consistent it is, like whether it's instant or not. But I know that when I deploy the files, I've never seen a delay on any of these servers for it. So, but that's one of the things that's really good feedback. And there's probably an issue open on the GitHub repo, which you can find by clicking on one of these links, which you can link you to.
Happy to hear that we are already like able to provide some feedback also. So that's really nice. Anyway, so if anybody has still like some other questions, feel free. And if not, I guess we're gonna wrap up with the last question, which is a bit like on topic and off topic at the same time, because you have like a lot of extensive experience with Angular. So maybe you can offer us like some tips which you wish that people would be doing more when developing Angular applications.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because I teach a lot of Angular and I look at a lot of Angular apps, and not just Angular, but the other technologies as well that you see on the screen here. And one of the things I don't see enough attention to is Angular. Angular has this out of the box with the HTTP interceptors. Now we talk about these a lot, but how you actually use them in the real world, there's great use cases beyond just setting up headers, for example, in your API calls. You can also use them to make read-only data or to do authentication or set up CSRF for security. And it's really easy to set these kinds of things up. There's some really good documentation up in the Angular docs. I've also got some presentations and workshops on them too. But it's a topic I don't think people spend enough time on. And not just in Angular, but also in React, Svelte, and Vue. You can do these things with Axios if you're using, because that's what they use for HTTP generally with like Vue and React. If you're using Fetch API out of the box, a little more work. But I'd say if you're using Angular or Axios, using interceptors is really easy and it adds a ton of business value. So that's my tip for you all.
Sounds great. Like, I guess like the Axios got like inspired, right? Like by the first AngularJS HTTP client, if I understand correctly. So, and of course, as you said, like now it's also used by these other libraries, when one of the main features was like ability to specify these interceptors because they are so useful. So I highly encourage people, like, check out those blog posts, Google it. John already written about it. So yeah. Anyway, John, thank you again very much for coming and sharing all this info today. And wish you a great rest of the day, and hopefully see you in the future. Oh, there is another question. I'm sorry.
No worries.
So there is a question from Simon. What about deployment on my hosted Windows server? How would that fit in the deployment chain? Is it possible to set up something like this?
Deployment to your host Windows server?
Yes, so supposedly, like, I guess it's like somehow like in-house hosted like Windows server or something like this, yeah?
Right, not to your own. Yeah, so what this does, and it works, it actually deploys it to the Azure cloud. And if you're familiar with like Netlify or Versal or some of the others, that's what they do as well. So none of these out of the box I'm aware of, or at least with Azure Static Web Apps, will deploy to an on-premise server. Could you do that yourself? You can. And actually, taking a little liberty, one of the things you can do is all the stuff I showed, you don't need any of the tools, Versal, Netlify, or Azure Static Web Apps to do it. You can do it all yourself today. The only reason these kind of tools exist is because setting up all these things on your own means you're basically setting up like a dozen cloud services and trying to figure out how to connect them all, which is time consuming, difficult, and could be expensive. That's why these services exist, because there's a need for us to be able to deploy all this stuff in one fell action. So does it deploy to a local server today? No, it does not. But that's actually really good feedback and something I encourage you to add to our GitHub repo.
Definitely makes sense. Like, as you said, like those use cases keep repeating themselves. Like we have this static website or web apps, we need to deploy them. Doesn't matter which framework we are using, doesn't matter which kind of library we are using. It's always kind of the same. And this is why this is provided, because people need to do that. And it would be pretty complex to set it up by yourself every time you need to do it. So we are really grateful for all these possibilities that nowadays is like easier than ever to just like have stuff up and running on that scale. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So then I guess we are done. So again, thank you very much, John, and wish you great rest of the day. Hopefully to see you in some future edition of Angular Day Verona. Maybe
Thank
also.
you very much.